So let me just reemphasize what a great honor it is to have Basil here. We've known him for a very long time. I've known him for a very long time. He's been a key member of our faculty in the EMPA program for more than a decade. He brings not only academic expertise, but as some of you know, he's bordering on at least a minor celebrity. It's only a few times that I turn on the TV that he's not there on CNN or MSNBC or even, God forbid, Fox every once in a while. But, you know, if you want to have success, you got to talk to all sides.
Yeah.
He also, in addition to his communications and his consulting and his teaching, he also has a long experience in both politics and community affairs. He was the executive director of the Democratic Party in New York State for a number of years under, beginning at least under then Governor Patterson and later under Governor Cuomo. And that makes him, at that time, the second ranking Democrat in a very blue state. So it's a pretty impressive and important position. And frankly, probably one of the most difficult jobs outside of the medical profession in the world. In some respects, I'm surprised he survived. It's tough to survive. The Democratic Party, as many of you know, particularly in places like New York, is more like 10 parties all fighting together most of the time. So he did a great job on that. And then he's been very involved in community affairs, involved in the establishment of a charter school, member of fraternal organizations, is a major influencer and participant and community builder in this area, meaning Harlem and Morningside Heights and this general area where Columbia also calls home. So he's been always on the forefront of helping us out, and this is an area where his experiences and his life and his academic expertise and his political expertise all.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. And yeah, I've realized that we have known each other for quite some time. For those who are students there, I was a MPA student from 1994 to 1996. So there's hope for everybody. So please, please take to heart that it is a wonderful place to be there at SEPA, and I learned so much. And owing to the long history that Bill and I have, you do have great supports, and you make some very lasting and sturdy relationships. So before anything, my advice to the students that are on is to stick with it and be strong and really enjoy your time here and the discussions and opportunities that the school certainly can afford. And if there are those that are looking to do their EMPA, definitely come. It's a wonderful place, and I like to stay in touch with all my students and invite them to all of the stuff that I end up doing that Bill sort of outlined. So again, thanks, Bill, for the introduction opportunity to speak here. It's obviously a very difficult time, and I want to talk through some points, some things that I shared in a document I wrote the other day. Certainly some things have transpired since then that I'll sort of update everybody on. But I really want to make this a bit of a dialogue so that we can talk and ask questions and hash out some ideas, because this is all a work in progress, and so it's important not just to get it right, but also to think through what can work and what can't, and the impact on actual people's lives. So these protests, these Black Lives Matter protests are now in their fourth week in the wake of George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, amid calls to defund the police. But since then, states and municipalities have taken a really hard look at police reform legislation. We saw that the city council in Louisville had acted quite swiftly after the killing of Breonna Taylor to enact Breonna's Law, which has banned no-knock warrants. We've seen Governor Cuomo, I believe, yesterday signing a package of police reforms that moved through the Democratic-controlled state Senate and state assembly fairly quickly. We've seen the NYPD announce a reassigning of 600 officers, I believe, from their plainclothes unit, which, among other things, is meant to decrease the number of stop and frisk encounters, which as many, if or not all of you on this part of this dialogue know, had been very controversial and actually had gone to court. Activists had taken the city to court to end. We know that the president has announced an executive order on police reform, though we don't know exactly what's in it. But there is an announcement coming on police reform. And the city of San Francisco, interestingly enough, has announced that the police department will no longer respond to non-criminal calls. So some of the things that Bill and I were talking about earlier, things like any cases related to mental illness, homelessness, school discipline, neighbor disputes, those things will no longer be dealt, those loans will no longer be handled to the police department, but will be handled by trained, unarmed professionals. But obviously, this is not an easy task when you're dealing with a country with over 18,000 law enforcement agencies, and we know that despite all of the changes and the need for change and the impetus for change, that we will still face significant problems. Look at the unrest recently in Atlanta, where you had Rashard Brooks shot 2 times in the back, and the medical examiner has ruled that a homicide. And SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, has said yesterday they will not look at qualified immunity for police officers. So that issue, that question remains unanswered, I guess, from the point of view of the Supreme Court, that we will still be living with some form of qualified immunity for police officers. So as I think about the changes that are being proposed and what is taking place across the country, and look at what the House did yesterday, and as we were talking earlier, I moderated a panel with 4 House Democrats, including the majority whip, Jim Cleaver, to talk about how important getting legislation on the table is, that some of the legislation that is being proposed, a lot of these changes from a political parlance are low-hanging fruit, meaning that these are things that were proposed before but just didn't have the opportunity to pass because they didn't have the votes or because of some other political challenges. But these are things that had been proposed for many, many years prior, but given what we would call the focusing event, the political shock, if you will, the fact that you had this killing of George Floyd and the protests that have come after it, this was an opportune moment to enact this legislation and get some meaningful change on the table. And if you, I guess one of the things that I also look at is the way in which corporations have been managing this also. And if you think that protests can't move mountains, just look at the fact that NASCAR has disallowed any use of the Confederate flag at any of their events. And I don't think for any of my colleagues we would ever have thought that we could see that kind of change. But certainly we are in the midst of an extraordinary moment, a moment that seems to me to be unprecedented in my lifetime, certainly. Maybe it goes back, maybe Bill has seen this. He's a little older than I am, so maybe Bill has seen this before. But for me, this is an unprecedented time, and I go back to a little over 20 years ago when Amadou Diallo was shot at for 41 times and hit 19 times in his doorway in the Bronx, where I grew up. I had the opportunity to meet and work with his mother, and he was an immigrant. My parents are immigrants, so this was a very personal. That was a very personal issue for me, and I remember even in the protests that occurred subsequent to that. And I was out there. I marched off across the Brooklyn Bridge, and we did see changes then. But again, there's still so much work to be done, as evidenced from everything that's happening today. And I do think we're in the midst of two pandemics, right? We're in the midst of a virus that has really decimated communities of color, but we're also in the midst of another one, which is the 400-year scourge of racism, and both overt and systemic and institutionalized. So to an attempt to extricate race and racism from so much of the work that in so many of the institutions that exist inside and outside of government, and so much of the work that needs to be done. This is not something that can occur overnight, but it will occur when there are well-meaning people at the table engaged in meaningful dialogue, which I hope we are part of that today. But some of the challenges that I think are ahead, as I see it, I think are important to take a quick look at. One of the things that came up on the event that I had yesterday was with Congressman Emanuel Cleaver. He's a former mayor and the first African-American mayor of Kansas City. And one of the things I talked to him with online and then offline were about some of the challenges that mayors have. If you look at the mayors who've really been at the forefront of some of these discussions, it's San Francisco, Atlanta, DC, and Chicago, all African-American women, by the way. But he talked a little bit about the challenge, particularly of African-American mayors as well, first-time cities where they're having their first African-American mayor in particular, and the challenges of trying to balance law enforcement and keeping, quote, law and order, but also understanding the unique challenges that African-American communities face when dealing with law enforcement and trying to manage sort of police-community relations. You talked about the fact that union contracts play a very big role in this, and some of the need to sort of make and create these and perpetuate union contracts that may not allow for mayors to discipline or terminate some of these officers that behave poorly or that have substantial records and disciplinary records when it comes to how they engage the public. There is obviously the police culture and how difficult that may be to break apart, so that you have the opportunity to have officers be able to sort of discipline their own. In other words, can police culture change so that if one officer sees another officer doing something that they shouldn't be doing, are there going to be any repercussions for that? What is the peer pressure like? There's a case in Buffalo that has been talked about a little bit lately, because as we've been talking about those officers that stood by while the one officer in the case of George Floyd had his knee on the neck, on his neck, no one did anything. You can see officers standing around. And what is interesting about that and sad in every case is that if you look at their responses, it looked like this wasn't something that was shocking to them, that they may have seen this before, right? And so they did not respond. But there was a case of an officer in Buffalo that did actually intervene, an African-American woman that did actually intervene when a colleague was using force that she believed was excessive and stopped her colleague from going further, she wound up getting fired. And so there's a new look now at not only that particular case, but of a culture that keeps officers from sort of, lack of a better term, policing and monitoring themselves. So union contracts and police culture, there had been a tremendous push to get more officers of color on police forces across the country. New York has a very diverse police force that actually engages in very significant training, probably does more training about inclusivity and diversity than any other municipality in the country. But again, problems do persist. So one of the things that I think is interesting to look at as a point of potential future research is to look at, take a deep dive into these union contracts and to take a look at how the abilities that mayors have or don't have to discipline officers and what that means in terms of trying to create a police force that may not, that has a better relationship with the community, but also B, would be able to de-escalate problems as they arise, so that you don't have situations like George Floyd or this situation in Atlanta, but also to create a force that gains the trust of the community. And I think also for future research, looking at things like peer pressure, looking at the impact that diversity within departments has on policing and on these very violent incidents that we've seen pop up. There's a real question about the role about these protests themselves and how they've been organized and their organic nature. And it's interesting for a person like me that focuses a lot on community activism and looks at sort of the history of movements and of civic engagement. One thing that has come up, which is really interesting, is the role of the clergy and the fact that with multiple populations across the country, religiosity is decreasing. So we've seen, particularly in areas like Harlem, where some of our historic churches are being sold to developers because there's no attendance and the churches can't pay can't afford to stay there. So you have a decrease in the number of folks who are going to church and who feel that religion is a substantial, organized religion is a substantial part of their lives. And historically, if you look at a lot of civil rights movements, the church has been a very important part of that. But we have seen in this social media environment, particularly with young people, that yes, you do have a number of clergy members there and in the forefront, but these are very local protests. They're hyper local, which is great in many ways. But it also, one way that it's important is that it actually helps put a lot of very local pressure and very specific pressure on local leaders who have obviously re-election ambitions, and it gets them to be more accountable. But it also really does say a lot about how social media has managed to change the way we organize. There were two articles that came out over the weekend. One that talked about the end of Black politics, and the other that said that young people, particularly African-American young people, are very skeptical of the Democratic Party. Those two things are very important to look at because, number one, on the one hand, it in some ways devalues the importance of some of the leaders who have been through a lot of these struggles. But it also says that the political institutions don't engender the kind of trust from the next generation that it did for my generation, for example, as a Gen Xer. And that's going to be really interesting going forward, because for a Democratic Party that believes that it's a big tent And where my political heroes were, like David Dinkins, like Ron Brown and Barack Obama, obviously. What's the future of the party itself? What's the future of the two-party system? But also for a lot of these older leaders who look at young people and say, we need you to be in the party because there's a value in working outside and there's a value of working inside. You still need to pass laws. You still need to get elected to create legislation. What is the future of the party going to look like? So that skepticism and this concern that there's an end to Black politics, I think, has damaged relationships between older and younger generations, and there needs, I think, to be a little more dialogue and repair there. But it also raises a lot of questions about the role that institutions within our community, particularly African American church, have going forward when inevitably problems and protests arising from a lot of these issues with respect to police violence will occur. When all of this is happening, where 2020 is is the backdrop, right? So you have all of this new energy, you have these focusing events, you have this opportunity for new and important legislation to get passed. So what does this mean for the presidential race? Well, one of the things that I asked Congressman Cleaver about yesterday is the notion that there is potentially this reigniting of a movement, whether it's a reigniting of the civil rights movement or the reigniting of a new movement. But the hope is that all of this activity does have ramifications for our electorate, for our electoral politics moving forward. And remember, it's not just about how many votes come out, it's where those votes come out. And there is, again, this renewed attention to the challenges of actually exercising your right to vote. We saw all of these problems in Georgia last week, and there are more problems that will arise with not just states in the southern region, but across the country. We saw what happened in Wisconsin. And there are going to be real challenges for voters who want to see change, coming out of these protests, but can't actually get the right to vote. That matters because as much as we talk about the importance of presidential politics and electing a capable person in the White House, state and local policy, I argue, have the most effect on your day-to-day lives. And those elections tend to be much lower in terms of turnout, but very, very, very important. This is a presidential year, so we expect relatively high turnout, but when you have the challenges that are being laid in front of us, particularly if you're poor or elderly or a person of color, and you layer on top of that the challenges that COVID-19 has brought to us with an expansion of mail-in voting, changes in your polling places, fear of going out into a polling site for fear of potentially getting sick. When you layer all of those things on top of an already, effort to tamp down votes, I do worry about the future. And I worry about whether or not, again, we have the ability to capture all of this energy and create an electoral revolution, if you will. But if you're looking at this from the point of view of constituencies, there is also, and you're a Democrat, for example, there is also some light at the end of the tunnel. Trump constituencies, according to some polling, are starting to leave him. Whether it's older middle-class white men or suburban white women, those are constituencies that Trump had counted on that are now starting to take a look at Democrats, which is a good thing if you're a Democrat, and or you just want different type of leadership. There has been, starting in 2018, but certainly prior to that, but we saw a lot of this in 2018, a strong move toward more progressive politics at the local level, and certainly at the when Democrats were able to take back the House, but we've seen it on a local level, which is why, particularly in the state of New York, which is reliably blue for presidential elections, but our state Senate was Republican controlled for most of the last 60, 65 years. So it was hard to get certain pieces of legislation passed, but now both houses in the state, the Assembly and the Senate, are not only have Democratic majorities, but are headed by two African Americans in the case of the Senate, an African American woman. So from state to state in how the Democrats have been able to flip state legislatures, this is a really important moment in time to affect some real change in terms of police and criminal justice reform. You know, we've looked at things like, we have looked at, it is important to look at things like training, which I've mentioned, contracts, which I've mentioned, and overall sort of the militarization of police departments, which really kicked into gear after 9/11. We sort of became much more aware of it in Ferguson, but certainly in the last few weeks, we've seen what the militarization of our police departments has looked like. A lot of that money is federal money, but let's think about what happens on the state and local level. So there's I think an opportunity for research there. And you know, as we talk about two very specific points that have come up in my sort of circles in the last few days, one is this issue of defunding the police. One of the things that I talked to Representative Cleaver about yesterday, which is something that Joe Biden also believes, you know, the defund is maybe just bad semantics for the movement, I guess is the best way to sum it up. In that, you know, which Trump and some Republicans have already latched onto. The real issue behind defund policing is just reorganize or redistribute some of those funds so that your funding issues and your funding policies that reduce the number of law enforcement contacts, as opposed to just straight saying we don't want police officers on the street. Again, when you think about what's happening in San Francisco, that should be part of it, that you're just reassigning police officers. You're taking, you're dealing with certain encounters differently, or assigning certain encounters to different agencies so that the police officers are not the sort of tip of the spear when you're trying to attack certain problems, that you can find other ways to attack certain problems. So, and we talked about that in terms of things like mental illness or homelessness, neighborhood disputes, school discipline. But you know, there are some models that are out there that are interesting. Camden has a model which if you know the history of Camden, was pretty revolutionary because it was known as a place that was very crime riddled. But so the notion of sort of not having a standard police force or a police force in the way we would normally think about it was revolutionary at the time, but it seems to have been welcomed, a welcome change in how in the city of Camden and the relationship with law enforcement. Minneapolis is talking about this as well. And so the real question I think that comes out of, one of the big questions that comes out of this is, you know, as we're looking to change policing from a function of actual law and order to public safety, like what does that look like? Can the federal government, through some of this legislation that the House has promoted, can it nationalize policing in certain ways or by certain standards? Can you create a new level of national standards? So there are real questions about, can it happen and do you want it to happen? Because there are a lot of folks that don't want the federal government adding another layer bureaucracy. And I think obviously comparisons to other countries is something that we should also look at in terms of how they approach public safety. But this is a time where there are opportunities, but also some headwinds. And I think the headwinds are generally political in nature, and developed largely because we've just done certain things for so long and felt like we have had success in it. We believe that more cops means lower crime, and that's not always the case. We believe that more funding means lower crime, and that's not always the case. And again, I think if smart people and people who are willing to come to the table have a real dialogue, have the opportunity to take a fresh new look at the data, then I think we can have some, coupled with the politics of the moment, I think we can have very legitimate and lasting change in both policing and public safety and criminal justice. So I'll wrap it up there, and if anybody has any thoughts or questions they want to add, I'm happy to, love to talk about it.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand in the participants section.
While people are thinking about it, let me start with, I have so many things I want to say. You and I have been talking a lot about this lately, so many of the things you said resonate with me. You mentioned Camden. Another that popped into my mind, Jersey City, which, by the way, the mayor is a SEPA grad, EMPA grad. And when he became mayor, this was long before what's been happening, he merged police, fire, EMS, and some more economically, like traffic, things that are non-policing, under one commissioner for public safety. And right along what you were saying, therefore, they have an institution that responds to things like what happened in Atlanta wouldn't have been a response by the police department. The traffic division, the transportation agency, would have responded initially with a tow truck to get the thing out. So in the training, we've talked on and on and on about, which I think is true. The one last point that I would just make and ask you about is about the defund police. I think it can be distracting for everybody because, in fact, in my view, and I'd love to hear yours, issues like inequality, like affordable housing, like affordable health care, like jobs with a living wage for everybody. Even if you eliminated the police, you'd have no near the amount of money. I mean, we need more public sector, more public-private partnerships to deal with these underlying issues. And that means, and I know you know this probably better than anybody, no politician wants to talk about higher taxes. Right. But it seems to me if we really want to get out of this mess, we got to deal with those underlying issues.
No, that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. We do. And the notion, if you deal with defund the police specifically and sort of that push, what's interesting that Cleaver has said is like, look, we've got nobody. And this is, and I'm going to get into a little sort of in-community conversation because, right, like if you're, the challenge with, police community relations, particularly when you're dealing with the African-American community, if stuff happens in our neighborhood, we're the first call we're going to make is to the police department. Like you don't want to not have somebody on the other end of the line when you make that call, right? You want the police to come and if my mother needs to go to the store and something happens to her, she gets mugged, God forbid. Now I got to call my mother today. She gets mugged, God forbid. I want the police to go track that person down and bring them to justice. Like you want that. What you don't want is you don't want police officers. You don't want people coming into your community and police officers for being sort of an occupying presence. James Baldwin wrote about that, sort of notes from an occupied territory, right? And that feeling that you're being that you're not even allowed to walk down the street without being considered a sort of suspect. So you have to engage in this balance. And one of the things that I heard a New York Times reporter say in the wake of the Amadou Diallo shooting is that police are trained to patrol for guilt and not innocence. So if you think about that and the perceptions of the people that they're engaging in certain communities, that's what you're sort of fighting against. So the defund mantra is important in all that it encapsulates. The concern is that we're never going to have that conversation. As Cleaver said, it's like if you have to explain yourself, you've already lost. And I think that's where the knee-jerk reaction to the defund campaign is. It's like we need to actually have these conversations, but if you're going to say defund, then I'm going to have to follow up with all this other stuff. Let's just focus on that stuff then. Let's focus on, services for the mentally ill, services for the homeless. Let's talk about how we deal with discipline in schools. In fact, let's talk about childhood trauma. We need to be focusing on those things because that's going to be very real when all is said and done. So yeah, there are so many other things that we focus on. Let's just call it what it is. Focus on those very specific policy areas, as opposed to this one catch-all of defund the police, which can be, in some respects, and what some elected leaders will say, can be very easily dismissed by the other side.
Thank you. I think we have a hand up. Aaron Bott, just if you could unmute. Go ahead.
My name's Aaron. I'm a recent SEPA grad. I also grew up in a suburb of Camden County, so I've been following a lot of what the movement and the media have been saying about using Camden as a model, but I wanted to ask your thoughts on whether you think that using Camden as a model is actually contrary to what the Defund the Police movement actually is trying to do, in the sense that Camden's police budget actually went up because they were buying all this technology. And while some people say that community relations between the Camden community and the police improved, it didn't actually reinvest back into the community. And also knowing the history of Camden, I mean, ultimately things are moving in a direction that almost, I think, reflect a slight gentrification now. So wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. No. So let me start with the first one and move backwards. The last one and move backwards. So yes, Camden, like other areas, are gentrifying, right? And that creates its own set of problems. One of the things that's interesting is if you go back to a couple of years ago, there was a famous, sort of infamous incident where a white woman called the police on these African-American families that were barbecuing in the park. Do you remember that? The first Karen incident that came to light, that actually happened in Oakland, in Barbara Lee's district. And if you know anything about Oakland, it is gentrifying significantly because San Francisco is extremely expensive. There was even a movie called The Last Black Man in San Francisco because it's no longer a very diverse place, and Oakland is becoming is becoming that as well. It's gentrifying, and so it's what we're seeing is that there is an increase in calls to police officers in areas that are gentrifying for these sort of quality of life problems in the way that they're being reported. Oh, there's loud music here, or there's this here, or there's that here, because a lot of the folks that come into these communities don't have the relationships and don't understand sort of what's been there before. And, it's creating some real tension. And so as that's occurring. I think it does speak to it does speak a little bit to the reforms that are being suggested, because the question then becomes, what do you want the police to actually go do? If somebody is barbecuing in a park and you don't think they should be there, should the police actually go and deal with that? Or who actually should be the institution, the agency that should do that? If there's music being played too loudly, or if you see someone that you think is bird watching in Central Park, right? And someone says, hey, you should lock up your dog. Do you want the police to come to enforce a leash law? So so I think what Camden was attempting to do, and what other cities are looking at now, is even if you can put out bigger expenditures, if you make bigger expenditures for technology, there's still a question of, what do you actually use the police to do? The physical person, that cop that you've trained and you paid and has benefits and pension, what situations do you put that actual police officer in versus what you can give to another agency? And then how do you pay for technology to help that police officer or that agency monitor the crimes that you want to, or the infractions that you want to focus on? How do you do that better? I do think that some expenditure is going to be required, and some of that stuff may be expensive, but it's a question of what do you physically put in what situation do you physically put those officers in, I think is really the question here. And that's why I say it's bigger than defund, because defund means you just take resources out. And I think that's how it's perceived. But it means so much more than that. And somebody put in the chat, defund Planned Parenthood. There is generally we all understand what that means, right? We all know what that means. And, it's when it comes to police departments, the folks who would not support changes in law enforcement are using it in similar ways. They want to say, oh, you want to defund the police department? That means you don't care about law and order. That means you don't care about, public safety. And so that's the concern that the folks who are pro-criminal justice reform are worried about. But yeah, I do think some expenditures and substantial expenditures are going to still be warranted. The question is, how do you move the actual officers around? What do you have them respond to? And if we're not increasing the size of our force, can we redirect that money elsewhere?
Thank you. You have Sam.
Hello, my name's Sam. I'm actually a student pursuing my master's degree in counseling. And the question I had was in regards to what advice would you give to someone pursuing a degree in counseling who wants to grow in cultural humility and utilize cultural sensitivity while working with clients impacted by systematic oppression and issues of racial injustice, similar to the ones we're discussing today?
Wow, that's a big question. The first thing that I would always say, and I have said, is that we all have our platform, right? And you use your platform to do the work that you want to do. So whether you're a school teacher, whether you sit on a board, Serena Williams' husband, who's the co-founder of Reddit, right? It was Reddit, left his board and said that he wanted to make sure that an African-American stepped into that void. So first and foremost, I think you use whatever platform you have to affect the change that you want. Secondly, I do spend, because my doctorate's in education and politics, I think a lot about young people and what they're experiencing, look, I watch the video of George Floyd and I get teary-eyed every time I watch it. And so imagine what's happening with a child, and imagine the kind of conversations that parents have to have with their children about policing. You actually saw that play itself out when, in an interesting way, when the mayor, very early in his tenure, and after the shooting and death of 2 police officers, said very openly that his son, he tells his son to be afraid of the police Now that's really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, I understand that as an African-American man having to navigate your environment that way, as he's telling his son he needs to do. But at the same time, if you're mayor, the police officers are your employees. So you're basically telling your son to be afraid of your employees. And that's really interesting in terms of, from a management standpoint. And I say that I raise that because I think that's the tricky balance here again, right? That we want an effective police force, yet we have, even I as a 48-year-old Black man have a fear of walking down the street and seeing a police officer and not understanding, not knowing what that interaction is going to be like. So use your platform, whatever that platform is. I think you understand, working with kids, getting them to be more civically engaged, but also finding ways to work with schools or religious institutions to manage trauma, I think becomes really important. And also, I think, as I was saying in terms of using platform, I think also using not only to elevate voices, but also using that platform to infuse more cultural sensitivity and culturally relevant dialogue and even curriculum to some extent, depending on where you are, I think is important. It's kind of, the way I look at it, it's kind of like people say, well, should Black History be taught every month, or should there be a specific Black history curriculum? And I said, yes, all of that. And, just infuse history with some truth and some cultural inclusivity. Again, it doesn't have to be separate. It could be part of everything that you do, but being intentional about it is probably the most important thing, to realize that we all have, we don't need to parse these things out. It's a part of all of our history. And I think understanding our collective, that we are stakeholders, that our collective, our role as stakeholders, that we are all in this together, I think is an incredibly powerful message.
Thank you. I think we have Nicole or Bill. Do you want to finish up, or I'll let Nicole?
Oh, sure. No, please.
Yeah.
Nicole.
Yeah, thank you. So my question has to do with, we were talking about training and reform. And one of the things that I find really powerful about like the idea of kind of just get rid of the police is because there's so much work to do, that the people that are currently within the system, they've been trained and they've been cultured into like this, in analyzing like the levels and layers of like how white supremacy exists in our culture, and different trainings that they've received in terms of like the comfort with like killing people, it kind of seems like, and then also and seeing like how just like different former police officers have explained how they kind of poo-poo the training, and they're like, oh, this is whatever, similar to how sexual harassment training like in offices is kind of like, oh, we have to go through this thing and sign this document saying that I received this. How do you manage or like visualize reform with individuals who have been acculturated to like this violent in some parts of the country like white supremacist job?
No, it's a great question. So, part of it is trying to layer on top of the training certain penalties that attach penalties to certain behavior, right? Because if you're, for example, in the department and you, so let's take chokeholds, for example, right? So you can, I guess, train new officers to find other ways around chokeholds. But then you have folks who have been on the job who may use that or a method that sort of approaches a chokehold, if it's not technically a chokehold. So how do you get them to change their behavior? That might be difficult to do unless you attach a criminal penalty to it, which is what New York State has done, right? And what the federal legislation is trying to do is attach a criminal penalty to that. So it's a bit of a deterrent as opposed to a retraining, which it doesn't really get to the core issue, but at least the attempt is to circumscribe the behavior of people who've already been trained a certain way. So for folks that are, so I think one part of the answer to your question is attaching criminal penalties or other types of penalties to behavior that might be hard to tease out. And I think the rest of it is, I guess, really a function of, and I'm not going to talk about throwing money at the problem, but there is something to be said about, I think, just looking at how we train officers, not just when they get to the academy, but there are over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. There are also over 14,000 school districts in this country. So there are 14,000 different ways to teach kids in this country, right? So what is that young student who grows up to be a police officer learning about communities, particularly communities of color across the country, right? So I think it really starts there. And then at a time when that young person decides that they want to go into law enforcement, they already have the tools to really be able to understand the communities that they're policing. But I do think another part of the challenge for folks that are not yet in the force, again, is something that I think we do need to look at, like what's actually happening in police academies. What tactics are they learning? Are they learning how to de-escalate situations? And again, if they're not put in certain situations to begin with, then that may take away half of the problems that we're experiencing altogether. Will you ever get rid of the scourge and the influence of white supremacy? Maybe not in my lifetime. But again, maybe what you do is attach penalties to behavior to make it be more of a deterrent than thinking that you can actually extricate it from the process and the institution altogether.
So we have 5 more minutes. So
we'll do a lightning round.
Can I?
Yeah.
Sure.
Just a couple of things. One, I think don't underestimate the power of training. I had it, I've been connected with the FDNY for decades and decades and decades, and behavior has changed dramatically in the FDNY several times. And it's all at its root training. And I would argue, in fact, not that many of the terrible things that have happened wouldn't have happened anyway, but many of them wouldn't if training would have been different. How you deal with escalating situations. Many of these things that had tragic results, people were trained to act the way they did. Now, you would always hope human beings, think a second and then say, wait a minute, yeah, I know I'm allowed to shoot someone who's running away, but if I'm told never shoot someone when they're running away, don't, even if you're absolutely right about carrots and sticks, giving people rewards for de-escalating you'd be surprised on what kind of influence that would have. Being honored is important for people. If you honor people by being nonviolent, by being negotiators, by being conflict resolvers, and turnover in public safety is rather rapid, not maybe by young people's standards, but by older people's standards, particularly police forces in places like New York with 20-year retirement. You'd be surprised how fast it turns over. So training has more power.
And if I could just add a quick point to that too. If you look at the tactic that was used in George Floyd's death, that knee to the neck, it's really amazing to think about the fact that there is no consensus across the country on that being a bad thing. And what I mean by that is that there is a lot of research that says that tactic can actually kill you but there are police departments across the country that will point to other research to say, well, it may be all psychological, or it may not be that positional asphyxia. That may be more psychological than not. So there's not even consensus on what we think might be obvious, that something like that is unnecessary. And again, I go back to the other point. Remember, he was handcuffed at the time. So there's no need to be on his neck if he's handcuffed, not to mention the fact that he's on his neck for 8.75 minutes.
Right. And that's why training has to involve people from outside the police department and outside the fire department, people with backgrounds like yours who have both a knowledge of how to educate people, but also an outside the department culture. To me, it seems like so absurd. No one in their right mind, in my view, would ever think about controlling someone by kneeling on their neck. It seems absolutely crazy to me, particularly when you had 4 officers. So, it's training, but it's also training with a panel of people designing the training so that it makes sense, not just in a criminal justice sense, but also in a real. But can I ask you one quick question?
Yeah, sure.
You have the opportunity to see Spike Lee's new film. And if so, do you see it as a bookend to Do the Right Thing? Because I think they're 2 of the most powerful movies written for their times that I would recommend to everybody on this call, by the way.
You mean The Five Bloods on
Yeah.
Netflix? I have not seen it yet. My friends have. I think I'm still wrapping up Master of None. I've got like so many shows in my queue right now, but I did mean to watch that because a friend of mine kind of made a similar comment. So I have to take a look at it. Maybe that's my tonight homework.
Do you think Do the Right Thing would be valuable for younger people?
Do the Right Thing is one of the most important. You know what? If I were to do a quick movie list, I would say Do the Right Thing. I would say certainly say Malcolm X. Both Spike Lee movies, which I thought were wonderful. I Am Not Your Negro by the story about James Baldwin, which I think is a tremendous documentary about his life and his thoughts. And I could come up with maybe I'll do that. I'll send around my reading list and movie list and documentary list, which I think
would be great. We've gotten requests for that. So
yeah, no, I listen, and then the documentary about the Anna DuVernay's documentary about the Central Park 5, I think is or the movie, the 4 or 5 part movie, I think is great. It really does talk about that time.
And Who Killed Malcolm X too.
And Who Killed Malcolm X, which was tremendous.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I'm happy to do that sort of a book list. James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket, which is on a bookshelf behind me, which is an extraordinary book and a list of his essays about police brutality and about white supremacy, I think is required reading. And The Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon is awesome as well.
That'd be great if you would do that. We'd really
happy to do that.
I think, Jeremy, we're out of time for today.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Professor Smikle.
No problem. And listen, by the way, if anybody wants to reach out to me separately, it's bas27@columbia.edu. I'm all over social media as well. Just look for my name. And I'm happy to sort of have offline conversations or do this again if need be.